Hello, everyone, and welcome. We'll just wait a minute or two as folks begin to sign in. For those just joining, we'll start in a moment. As soon as we just have a few more folks, we see the numbers going up. Everyone is logging in. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Eve Lipson, and I am the Assistant Director in J Street's Israel office. Welcome to Palestinian Politics 101. This is the 5th installment of J School. J School is an educational series of webinars with each session focusing on a different aspect of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Last week's J School session focused on the Israeli political system, and today we will be exploring the many complexities of the Palestinian political system. And I am delighted to introduce Sam Bahour, who will be the speaker for this session. Sam Bahour is a Palestinian American born and raised in Ohio and currently residing in Ramallah. He is managing partner of Applied Information Management, a consulting firm specializing in business development. He writes frequently on Palestinian affairs and has been widely published in many leading outlets. He is co-editor of Homeland, Oral History of Palestine and Palestinians, and you can read his blog at epalestine.com. So like many of our other sessions, we will have time for Q&A in the last 15 minutes. So please do feel free to drop any questions you have in the Q&A box as we go, and we will field as many as time allows. And with that, I will pass it over to Sam Bahour. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Eve, for the introduction, and thanks, J Street, for the opportunity. I'll jump right into a short presentation that I made to help guide us along. I should say first that I'm not an expert in the topic that I'm presenting. So I'm presenting it as someone who's living it more than someone who is an expert in it. Also, we're bringing this forward at a time where I'm not sure anybody exactly knows the full scale of Palestinian politics, because it is a moving target right now. And a lot of what I'm going to present are things that are under discussion, and we can talk about those towards the end. So Palestinian Politics 101, in talking with the team in preparing for today, it was called 101 for me to be able to stay at a basic discussion. So I will assume that people don't have a nuanced kind of understanding of Palestinian politics, but I'll be more than glad to answer any questions that are a little bit more involved. This is a picture of Gaza, by the way, when people are out on sea. So today's topics are the following. I'm going to talk about the Palestinian Authority, which is what everybody's talking about today and all the focus is on. Then I'll take a step back in a way to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, State of Palestine, put it within a historical context, and then talk a little bit about the current state of Palestinian politics and the potential for the future. And then I'll touch base a little bit on Palestinian public opinion. As I said, I'm starting with the Palestinian Authority, but before I do that, this entire discussion starts with fragmentation. If we recall, what happened in 1948 began the separation of the Palestinian community with a group of refugees on the left-hand side. It's those yellow dots, basically, in the region, and Palestinians who remained in Israel, and after 67, those who remained in the West Bank. So we are talking about a political entity which is formed in a state of fragmentation. On the right-hand side, that crazy looking map is basically the map of the West Bank. And I know there's many different kinds of maps. I like this one because the colors really make it as absurd as it is. So even if we're talking about the Palestinian politics within the West Bank or the occupied territory, we're talking about fragmentation as being a dominating driver of our discussion. So starting with the Palestinian Authority, sometimes called the Palestinian National Authority. The official name Palestinian Authority comes from the Oslo Accords. It was born out of those accords. The Palestinians have morphed that into something they call the Palestinian National Authority to give it more of an all-encompassing political kind of tone. This, as I said, was started with 1994 Oslo Accords. It's basically an administrative body, a government, which oversees the affairs of Palestinians in occupied Palestine. And even there, it's not the total of occupied Palestine. It is the West Bank and Gaza. East Jerusalem, having been annexed, is under Israeli control. Important word here is administrative body, and I'll get to that in a second. The trappings of this Palestinian Authority are the trappings of a government of any kind of state. So it has an executive branch with a prime minister. That's the picture above here where Mahmoud Abbas is giving the current prime minister his mandate. The current prime minister is Dr. Mohammed Shtayyeh. There's a legislative branch of government as well called the Palestinian Legislative Council, abbreviated PLC. And there's a judicial branch, which is supposedly an independent judicial branch, but in our reality, that's been muddled with politics as well. And I'm going through this kind of like in a bullet point fashion so we can get to the conversation. There's a lot to talk about on all these points. In 2006, we had our last elections, national elections here, and Hamas won those elections, which was in a free and fair kind of electoral process. And I need to note here that we did have democratic elections, but we don't have a democratic society. And those are two different things. When Hamas won, it led to a division because Fatah, the leading party of the Palestinian Authority prior to those elections, was not keen on relieving its authority to the competing party Hamas. And we ended up with a political split in addition to the geographic split that has already been there because of the Israeli occupation. I must note that the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian National Authority, is not responsible for negotiations, and it has no decision-making authorities therein. I need to make that clear because people today kind of only talk about the Palestinian Authority without understanding the other components of the Palestinian political system. The Palestinian Authority, as we said earlier, is an administrative body taking care of the people's day-to-day needs under occupation, not much more than that. Other than the members who are elected to the Palestinian Legislative Council are automatically part of the bigger overarching legislative body of the PLO called the Palestine National Council. And I'll talk about that in a second. So when we talk about the Palestinian Authority, we're basically talking about whether it's in Gaza or the West Bank, is some kind of control, not full control, on the areas which are marked in red. And I wanted to touch base when I talk about the Palestinian Authority because it's an important issue in discussing the reality here, is all the different security kind of structures that the Palestinian political system has. There are two kinds of tracks here. One is under the auspices of the president. That would be President Mahmoud Abbas today. And that's basically General Intelligence Services and the Presidential Guard. And the Prime Minister, through the Minister of Interior, are responsible for all other security agencies, including the police, the civil police. I should note here that currently the Prime Minister is acting as a Minister of Interior as well. And this is one of the points which people are bringing up as a negative of why the Prime Minister has not appointed a Minister of Interior different than himself up until now. But this just shows the security apparatus of the official Palestinian security agencies. The next organization I want to talk about is actually where I should have started, but I wanted to start with what is familiar to people. Why should I have started here? Because the Palestinian Liberation Organization is the all-encompassing entity, which is the Palestinian Political Agency. And those are trick words. Palestinian Political Agency means that they are the representative of the Palestinian people. Inside that agency, there's a mess. But I don't have to tell you that, for example, if you're living in the US, right? You have a president called Trump. Behind him is a mess. And I can say the same thing about Israel today. But there is a political agency in all three, Israel, Palestine, and the US today, which is recognized on the global scene. And for the Palestinians, that is the Palestinian Liberation Organization. It's the Palestinian Liberation Organization that actually signed the Oslo Accords on behalf of the Palestinians. It was founded in 1964 in Cairo, Egypt, was the beginning of that discussion, where the Arab League basically, to put it in kind of raw terms, wanted to dump this Palestinian issue on Palestinians' lap. They didn't want to continue to take, as the Arab League, representing all the Arab states, the responsibility for the Palestinian issue. So the Palestinian National Council, which is a legislative council of the PLO, was actually convened in Jerusalem in May '64, and the PLO itself was founded in 1964, June 2nd. So we can see that this was created long before the military occupation that started in 1967. The focus of that struggle that this organization was founded to resolve at that time was returning of refugees home, because after the state of Israel was created, that community of 700,000 refugees, after 10 years of kind of waiting, could not find a way to get home. So the PLO was the answer to organize them to come back home. Now, the Palestinian Liberation Organization today is a very complicated organization. And although I'm going to present what's on the right very briefly, I should also note that a lot of the boxes that I'm talking about are hollow shells today. And that's why there is a very loud and articulate call for reforming the PLO, because those boxes either need to be taken out of this map or they need to be filled. If we start with the Palestine National Council, that's on the top there, which is like the overarching legislative body, the first body that was created for the PLO. As you can see on top there, some of its members are independents. Other members are representatives of popular organizations, like the Union of Workers, the Women's Union, the Students' Union, teachers, writers, lawyers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I actually entered this entire apparatus as a member of the General Union of Palestinian Students in Youngstown, Ohio. And that's how I got to know this entire apparatus through my student lens. So if you were a leader in one of these unions, we would call them associations in Western kind of terminology, you would be automatically a representative in the Palestinian National Council. On the right-hand side of this map are the political parties that comprise the PLO, and Fatah, the first one there, is the one which is currently monopolizing rule here in the West Bank. The others that are there are historic parties that have been part of the PLO. I would say that probably half of them are defunct today, but they're listed because there hasn't been reform to be able to either take them off or add new ones on. If you notice on the right-hand side, Hamas is not listed here, and that's the contention today between the two sides. Hamas is not a member of the PLO, and there's a big debate on how they should become a member, et cetera, et cetera. But today, Hamas is outside of this organization. The Palestinian National Council created something called the PLO Central Council. Remember, this whole story started with fragmentation. So that Palestinian National Council spread out across the world. It would be too difficult and costly to bring them together every year. So something was created, like a central council, it was called, hoping that that can be kind of in between Palestinian National Council meetings, that there would be a central body, like an executive body, to deal with day-to-day issues. Even that became too difficult to bring people together and too risky security-wise. So it created something called the PLO Executive Committee. That's in the center of this map. And that's the one in bold because that's the one which meets today. And when you hear statements coming out of the PLO today, that's where it's coming out of, less so than any of the other apparatus. The executive committee has a chairman. That chairman is the same as the president of Palestine today. Another contention within Palestinian politics that the same person is holding multiple offices. And you can see that through the chairman and through the executive committee, there are a lot of organizations dealing with finances, with politics. We can add to this a negotiations support unit, an education department, etc. One thing to note, this picture that I have on the left-hand side, this is actually the PLO building in Ramallah. It's actually walking distance from my house. It's closed today because they found a couple corona cases, so it's closed for 10 days. But this is where the operations of the Palestinian body actually does their business.
Sam, I just wanted to ask, there was a question about how Hamas fits into this, and I saw that Hamas isn't written under political parties. Is Hamas, in fact, fitting into that area the same way that Fatah or any of the other parties?
As noted, no. Hamas is not listed in the list of political parties. They are not a member of the PLO. And that's a significant note because the debate today in the community is we should bring Hamas into this political body to be able to be effective. Otherwise, you have a large chunk of the community which is rallying around a specific single political party. So there's no collectiveness in what they do. That's a whole discussion of how they could be brought into this PLO organization. And they want to come in, but they have conditions of how to come in, partly because this entire PLO has been dominated by Fatah for so long, they don't believe that the existing, for example, voting program, the voting structure would be fair. So they're asking for structural changes to happen for them to be able to enter, including some political things. For example, the PLO committed to the parameters of the Oslo Accord, and now the Hamas says Oslo Accord failed. Whoever comes into the PLO should not have to commit to those parameters. Those are the kinds of debates that are happening. But to answer your question directly, Hamas is outside of this structure completely.
Thank you for that.
To move a little bit further on the PLO, because it is so significant within the Palestinian political system, the General Assembly of the United Nations actually recognized the PLO way back when, in 1974, and allowed us to participate in the discussions in the General Assembly that deal with the issue of Palestine. And that was seen as a major milestone in getting international recognition of the Palestinian political representation. And if I go even one step further, in November of '74, we were then established as a permanent observer as the PLO. And that was something which was kind of groundbreaking for a national liberation movement to actually be granted observer status as a PLO. And I'm going, again, quickly through this, but in '88, and if you recall what was '88, it was the first intifada, where things were very tense here. In a resolution as well, the General Assembly acknowledged that when the Palestinians announced in one of their Palestinian National Council meetings in Algeria, their declaration of independence, and this was the first implicit, not explicit, but implicit recognition of the state of Israel politically. The UN kind of bear hugged that because they saw that the Palestinians were in the process of giving a concession, and it was implicit, but it actually was registered within the UN system. In September of 2011, I think that says, the PLO moved from the PLO to Palestine. And what I mean by that is that Mahmoud Abbas in his capacity submitted on behalf of the state of Palestine an application for United Nations membership for the state of Palestine. We have to remember here that this comes after 5 years of a failed Oslo process, which did not end the conflict in the 5 years that it was designed to. And then 15 years more of Palestinians trying to deal with the situation, kind of like in the fumes of the Oslo Accords, hoping that the international community would intervene. They didn't. So we had no other option but to go in 2011 to the Security Council and request full membership for the state of Palestine. That did not happen. The Obama administration, that administration which Israel loves to hate, not only gave Israel $38 billion in 10 years of aid, but also blocked the Palestinian bid for membership. And the Palestinians accepted to put the issue in a Security Council committee instead of having a vote on it. And that's where it sits today. But we didn't stop. I mean, after that, in 2011, we went to UNESCO, which is the United Nations educational outfit. And it's an organ of the UN. And every organ of the UN has different membership requirements. UNESCO is the easiest to become a member because they want every state or state in the making to have an educational platform to work with. So we came to UNESCO, and 107 in favor, 14 against. We became a full member in the UNESCO organization. And that was a milestone because it allowed us the following year to actually go back to the United Nations, not to the Security Council, which did not pass our resolution, but we went to the entire General Assembly, the most multilateral body in the world. And we basically said, world, we have failed in bilaterally resolving this conflict through negotiations with Israel. And we need to ask, are we worthy of statehood or not as Palestine? And we all know what the results were. It was 138 yes, 41 abstained, and 9 no's. The US put itself not only with Israel, but with Micronesia, Palau, Nauru, and Panama, and the Marshall Islands. And that was embarrassing, if you ask me. I would say that this is a very important moment. It's actually the historic opportunity that Israel missed. This is where the implicit recognition of Israel that was embedded in our Declaration of Independence was transformed into explicit recognition of the state of Israel in a resolution that we ourselves as Palestinians brought to the table. It is such an important document. I highly recommend that you read the resolution. It's only about 3 or 4 pages. You'll find it on my blog at epalestine.ps. And that resolution basically says, recognize the state of Palestine with 3 borders and 1 yet to be defined, which is the western border with Israel. And it continues to say that western border must be negotiated with the state of Israel. And the majority of the world said yes. That created an ability for us to become a non-member observer state. That's the official status in the UN. It means a lot. It means that we not only become the state of Palestine, so we went from PLO to Palestine to the state of Palestine in the official books of the UN, but it also came with a toolbox. And when we opened up the new toolbox, we found all kinds of tools that we were waiting for. Things like you can hold Israel accountable directly. You don't have to wait for third parties to do so. You can enter into treaties, into different resolutions at the global level. And we started to use those. And in December 12th, it was confirmed that the state of Palestine itself was entered into what they call the Blue Book in the UN, which is the official terminology used within the UN. So the state of Palestine is there, it exists. And I note this because today a lot of the discussion is around 1 state or 2 states. What do you like? And I'm like, that's kind of a historic discussion. Both Israel and Palestine exist on paper today in the UN. So I'm not sure what we're talking about when we're still trying to choose between 1 or 2 states. There exist 2 states today. One of them is occupied, but that's a different level of a discussion. And then, as I said, as we became an observer member to the UN, we started using those new tools that came in that toolbox. One powerful one was the ability for us to enter into treaties. And these treaties are becoming problematic for Israel because Israel is a member of many of these treaties as well. And when we can bring a treaty to bear, we are no longer making grand statements every September at the General Assembly opening session. Now we can bring issues like water, like telecommunications frequency, et cetera, to the various bodies of the UN which are responsible for overseeing those issues. The most recent one was the Palestinians brought a case against the Israeli side at the Universal Postal Union. There is such an entity which controls the postal regulations of the world. I'm very interested in what we brought to the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, to try to get rights of our frequencies assigned to us. Those are the kinds of things that are happening post that decision in 2012 to upgrade Palestinians to a state. Israel knows how dangerous this is because the biggest thing here is us going to the International Criminal Court, which is one of the pillars of international law, and bringing a case against Israel for its violations of human rights. Again, to take a step back and try to put this into historical context, 1948, the Nakba, is where this kind of started. Of course, it started long before that, but this is where we can put a pin and say this is the beginning of a major transformation. It took about 10, 15 years before the Palestinians started to think about organizing themselves politically. From 48 to 67, 64, 67, we're talking about a society in shock, not actually organized in a political agency, until the Palestinians organized themselves in 64 and started talking about bringing the refugees back, only to be hit by another round of refugees in 1967 with the occupation. Of course, a lot happened between 67 and 88, including the Lebanon War, but in 1988 is when that Palestinian Declaration of Independence was announced, and it's a one-page document. I highly encourage you to read it, and you will find there embedded our historic concession to the state of Israel on 78% of historic Palestine. In 1991, kind of as a fallout of the first Intifada, something called the Madrid Conference started. And the Madrid Conference was an international conference, and the players, mainly the US, along with Israel, refused to allow the PLO to be represented in the Madrid Conference. Instead, they allowed Palestinians who were here under occupation to be tacked on to the Jordanian delegation. So that was the beginning of Palestinians coming to the international arena, but we came through a Jordanian kind of door. In 1993, things changed. Those secret negotiations that were happening at the same time that the Madrid Conference was being talked about and worked on, Arafat and the PLO were discussing behind the scenes in Oslo the actual Israeli recognition of the PLO itself as the representative of the Palestinian people. And interestingly, in Oslo, before the Oslo Accords were signed, the Palestinians took the first move. We were kind of coaxed into taking the first step to get the Oslo Accords off the ground. What was that step? It was the formal, written, explicit recognition of the state of Israel. And that's something most Israelis shake their head at when I say it because they don't believe it. And I have to tell them to go look at the actual document that it was scanned and it was on the Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs website. I'm not sure if it's still there with this administration, but that is a formal recognition in writing. So in 1988, we had implicit recognition. In 1991, we had formal recognition that was acknowledged by Israel. You would expect that if we recognize the state of Israel, in turn, they would recognize the state of Palestine. They did not. Yitzhak Rabin replied and only recognized the PLO as being the representative of the Palestinians. That was another missed opportunity to look at us as equals to be able to resolve this conflict. We all know what happened from 1993 to 2000, the Camp David Summit, which collapsed, which started the Second Intifada, and then we kept in the process. We stayed in the game all the way into 2012. At this point, the Palestinians were totally convinced that Israel had no intention whatsoever to resolving this conflict through negotiations, especially because 20 years of negotiations, the settler community went from 100,000 to 600,000. That's why we went to the UN. So what's the current state of Palestinian political politics? In one word, it's a mess. I actually put this just to show that I am one of many who are speaking out very publicly in Arabic and in English, telling the Palestinian leadership that it has to get its act together. And I actually put out an open letter. I actually put out two. This is the first one that got a lot of attention, which has 8 steps in it. One is President Abbas holds too many chairs, chair of the PLO, president of Palestine, head of the Palestinian Authority. And that is not healthy. And he's an elderly guy, and he's under security issues with Israel as well. And we're telling him, you need to appoint deputies at least in case something happens to you tomorrow morning. I also made a call for him to go to Gaza personally tomorrow morning and to keep going every week, engaging all of the parties that are in Gaza, because this division internally is not helping us in the Palestinian context. I've also asked that he enact, which he will not do, that he enacts and activate a new Palestinian political party law. What do I mean by that? If I wanted to run for office tomorrow for a new party, I want to create a new party like I can do in most political systems that are democratic. I have to be able to go register my political party. There is no place to go register today a political party. And that's why we have that antiquated list of political parties with no newcomers added to the list. It doesn't make sense that for 50 years, there hasn't been new thought, political thought within the younger generations that want to come forward and organize themselves politically. I've also asked, there is a entity that was created in the Palestinian Authority during the Oslo time. It's called the Central Elections Commission. This is a Palestinian commission which is responsible for all the elections that happen here in Palestine. Even though we haven't had national elections since 2006, we regularly have local municipal elections, and the Central Elections Commission is responsible for those. I ask, now that Oslo has failed as a process, that Central Elections Commission start registering Palestinians around the world. It makes no sense to me that the Palestinians do not have a registry of all of their people. And if they do, we're not privy to that information, but I don't think they do. The only centralized list of Palestinians sits with the Israeli government. They control the Palestinian population registry, not only for the West Bank, but for every child that's born in Gaza, also gets to be put on the Israeli population registry. A little irony there. In one mouth, Israel wants to say they have nothing to do with Gaza, and in another mouth or another breath, they want to be sure that they have full control of the population. And then I asked for elections to be held at all levels. And in my letter, I'm clear. When I say elections, I don't mean, God forbid today, US-style elections. They're not going to be pristine elections, because in our fragmented reality, which is what I started with, proper, pristine elections cannot happen. So I call for elections where they can happen properly to happen, and where they can't, like Jerusalem or some Arab states, that civil society has a representative role. We have to be creative in how we have a more representative Palestinian political system. And then I talk about the Palestinian National Authority. It played a role during the Oslo process. Now it needs to play a different role because we're no longer talking about that we're on the verge of ending occupation. We're actually on the verge of another annexation. And that needs to change the way the Palestinian government views how its actions should happen and where its budgets are going. And then lastly, a little bit off topic for today's discussion, I talk about the need for us to lead our solidarity movement. We have solidarity all around the world, but lack of centralized leadership from the source is causing the solidarity movement to take different shapes and forms, not all of it to our benefit. And then I would also call on the Palestinian political system to take the US seriously. Yes, Trump has done us wrong, and I do believe that it was proper to stop negotiating with a Trump administration after Trump closed the PLO office, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I also tell this administration here in Palestine that the US is a very complicated political animal, and the White House is only one place that you can do politics. But it doesn't seem to be absorbed by the leadership that they need to work in all 50 states, because ultimately all 50 states is what's represented in Washington, not vice versa. And then what are the futures for the Palestinian politics? I'm part of an organization, it's not even an organization, it's an initiative called the Palestine Strategy Group. You can actually find us at palestinestrategygroup.ps, Palestine PS. And we just produced a report called Palestine 2030, and we called it a decade, an upcoming decade of clarity and renewal. If the Trump administration and the Netanyahu administration have done anything positive, they have removed all of the fig leaves from the reality. So now we can see in pure raw form what the different entities' positions are. And that has led us to come up with three kind of big picture tracks. I'm sure there's more. One is reciprocity, that we should take all acts of colonialism, not occupation, what they do every day, but to go back to all acts of colonialism and start to address them as they are, and not give kind of concessions before we're sitting at a negotiating table. The other track, and this is the one I actually support, is a renewal of the Palestinian political system and to build the capacity required to impose national independence. And I can talk about that later. And then you have the third track, which is kind of the track being talked about with the younger generation who have lost hope in people like me who still think two states can happen. And they're calling for to come full circle to where the Palestinians started by calling for one state. But one state in the minds of most of those people calling for that is not Israel as we know it today. It is a decolonized state. So it's not the Israel that we know. Actually, if you ask me, it's the removal of Israel from the equation as a state. And that to me is not a solution. That's why I don't call for it personally. Lastly, in terms of what are the attitudes in the community, one of the leading, if not the leading polling institution here is the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. They actually do a lot of work with Israeli research teams as well. And they do joint stuff so they can compare between the two societies. This is one of their latest reports from June. And I just want to point out three things here which I think are worthy to note. In terms of legislative and presidential elections, if they were to be held, the person who gets the most support is Marwan Barghouthi, who's imprisoned by the state of Israel. So a lot of people ask, where are your leaders? Well, a lot of them have either been killed or are sitting in Israeli prisons. And it's interesting here that when compared between Hamas's leader, Ismail Haniyeh, or Abbas, Hamas's leader actually gets 49% compared to 42. But when you compare them to somebody who's also Fatah, who is Marwan Barghouthi, but has a track record which is not tainted kind of with the Oslo process, you find him that he can beat Hamas as well. That's an interesting statistic. Also, I would point at the parliamentary elections. Fatah is getting 36 and Hamas is getting 34%. If you add the margin of error, the community is split down the middle. Think Republican, Democrat. This is a community which is polarized, especially when you have one of the parties outside of the PLO political agency, but they're still able to garner 34%. That's a lot. And then a troubling statistic that on the bottom there, in terms of the peace process and the deal of the century, the public is divided on the best means of ending the occupation. 45%, the highest number, is now talking about armed struggle to go back to where we kind of started. 24% think negotiations, and most of those probably are people who have a vested interest in the current political apparatus, so their payroll is coming from the Palestinian Authority, for example, and then 22% think that nonviolence can work. Those are troubling statistics. Having said all of that, I look at all statistics from here, from Israel, from anywhere, with a big grain of salt, because it depends on the mood of that day, and it also depends on how you ask questions. For example, in Israel, you can ask about the two-state solution. You'll find the majority of people are for. The majority of Jewish Israelis are for a two-state solution. Ask 3 follow-up questions that all allude to how to make it happen, and nobody wants to do what it takes to make it happen. So although these are indicative, they should also be taken with a grain of salt. I will end by noting something which I think is very troubling. We have, the discussion today is not new. Back when Ariel Sharon was Prime Minister of Israel, he had an advisor called Dov Weisglass, and Dov basically said in 2004, we educated the world to understand that there is no one to talk to. And we received a no one to talk to certificate. That certificate will be revoked only when this and this happens, when Palestine becomes Finland. So they know what they've created, a challenge that we cannot meet. And then more recently, we have David Friedman, who basically said, while he was speaking to a group of settlers, who he's part of, basically said, you don't have to live with the Palestinian state, talking about the Trump vision. You have to live with the Palestinian state when the Palestinians become Canadians. Also a clear indication that the conditions being put to the Palestinian side cannot be met. And I asked this question in the post that I put, why can't we just be Palestinians in Palestine and be left alone? But my answer to these 2 gentlemen is the following. These are beautiful kids from Gaza, and I can't guarantee much about this region, but I can guarantee 110% that they will never become Finns and they will never become Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam, for this very comprehensive presentation. I find that every time I hear a presentation about Palestinian politics, I learn something new that's very basic because it is so complex. And I wanted to start off by asking you to recap a few points. We had some questions of clarification coming in throughout, so I'll list just a few of them. So could you recap for us, what is the relationship between the PA and the PLO? How does Hamas fit into this? We understood that they're not in the PLO, so what were the elections that they won in 2006? And you mentioned elections several times throughout. If you could just clarify a bit more, who are we electing? And then lastly, Abbas. What we saw that he is the president of the PA. What position does he hold in the PLO? And can you clarify a bit the relationships there? So we'll start there, and then we'll move forward to more questions of conversation.
All 3 worthy clarifications, because I know it is complicated. In terms of the PA and the PLO is the ultimate organization which allowed the Palestinian Authority to take its mandate. So if we look at this as a mandate, the Palestinian Authority being given a mandate by the PLO to be the administrative body for those Palestinians like me who are living in the occupied territory. The Palestinian Authority does not have any mandate in the negotiations, which is the PLO's affair, doesn't have any mandate in terms of the refugees, which is not the Palestinian Authority's affairs, etc. So the PA is an administrative body. And in talking about it, I like to actually make it as small as I can, because it's been exaggerated in the common discussion to be everything, and it's not. The everything is the PLO. But I can understand why people are confused, because the PLO is not a functioning organization today like it should be. So it doesn't meet regularly. It meets every 10, 15, 20 years at a national level. And that's unheard of in organizational politics. Nevertheless, the entities of the PLO, like the Executive Council, which are responsible for the day-to-day affairs of the PLO, they are operating. They do have budgets. And that takes me to the last question, and I'll answer the second one after. Abbas is playing three major roles, and this is one of the big problems that I have with his positions. He is the chairman of the PLO. The PLO has a chairman at its helm. It's the position that Arafat held before he was killed, and now Abbas holds that position. So he's responsible for the overarching organization. He also took the responsibility for being the head of the Palestinian Authority. So he's the president of the Palestinian Authority and appoints a prime minister to run the day-to-day affairs on his behalf. And then thirdly, he actually has, in this new state of Palestine that was assigned in the UN, he plays the president of the state of Palestine. Now, Palestine isn't created yet on the ground. So the role of Palestine president and the PLO chairman are kind of one and the same. Having said all of that, those are three positions. He holds a fourth, but it's kind of like none of my business. He's the head of Fatah. I'm not somebody who supports Fatah, so they can pick whoever they want. So the man holds the largest party in Palestine's top position, the Palestinian Authority's top position, the PLO's top position, and this new state of Palestine, which is being created's top position. And that's one of the contentions with not dividing the authority amongst different people. Where does Hamas fit into this? Very good question. First, where did Hamas come into the picture? Hamas came into the picture long before the Oslo process. They actually came in the picture, I would say, around the first Intifada. And during the first Intifada, if we all recall, the Israeli side had not recognized the PLO. They actually were working to dismantle or destroy the PLO. So when Hamas came to the scene, they weren't blessed by Israel. Actually, the organization that Hamas emerged from was actually registered by Israel. But I can't make that direct connection. That organization produced something called Hamas. Hamas became the counter to the PLO. And Israel played with that for a very long time. And when Oslo happened, it happened with the PLO. It did not happen with Hamas. So Hamas was kind of excluded from that entire process. And then as the Oslo process continued, the Palestinians started having elections. We had several elections for legislative council members, for municipal members, and Hamas would always say, because we weren't part of this process, we are not going to deal with the elections. We're not going to be part of the elections. We are outside of this system. Until something happened. When Arafat left the political stage, Hamas probably felt this is an opening because Arafat was very heavy-handed. Abbas was not at the time. So they said in 2006, we're going to run for elections. We changed our mind. Yes, we never accepted the Oslo sanctioned elections, but now we're going to run. We're in the occupied territory, so we have the right in the occupied territory to run for the Palestinian Legislative Council. Remember, that's not the PLO, that's the administrative body. So they ran for elections, and the US supported those elections, and they won. And when Hamas won, everything got turned upside down. In perfect US style, they supported an electoral process, but they couldn't swallow the results. If only they can do that in the US. And then Hamas basically became divided. They took over by force the Gaza Strip, and Fatah took by force the West Bank. So Hamas today is a body which claims to have won the last elections and is a Palestinian Authority version in Gaza. And Fatah today says we are the Palestinian Authority version in the West Bank. One last point here, I know it's complicated, but one last point. Even though Hamas is outside of the PLO, they have repeatedly said, and I note this because it's a very important string that we all hold on to, they continue to say that the PLO is responsible for negotiating or doing anything on the international arena, even if we're not part of it. that's something to hold on to. Even though they're not a member of it, they have kind of given their blessing because they don't believe Israel's going to give anything to the Palestinian side. So they're not kind of worried that the Palestinians are negotiating. Up until now, they've kind of been correct. But that's a string to hold on to, because if we're serious about bringing the parties together so a solution can be negotiated for real, it's important that the Palestinian side is able to come together as a unified body. And for that to happen, the fragmentation has to stop. And that's why I started with the first slide of fragmentation. The more that Israel makes it impossible for us to even meet, to be able to have a political system, the more our political reality will be divided. And the last version of that we saw Abbas called, before Corona started, probably back in November, was calling for elections here. And he said, we will only have elections, and I think this is a wrong decision, but he said, we will only have elections if Israel allows us to have elections in Jerusalem. And they sent a request, and Netanyahu just ignored it. He didn't reply. And that caused us not to have elections, which I think was a wrong strategy. But that's the kind of role that Israel plays to make sure that we can't come together as a political body. That's not to say that if we came together under the same roof, everything is going to be great and we're going to kiss and make up. There are real divisions in our community. But I have to always remind US audiences that when pluralism entered into American politics, it was called the American Civil War. We haven't got there yet, and I hope we don't. But entering pluralism into political systems is not an easy game.
Thank you, Sam. Switching gears a little bit, we have a question from Paula Green. She asks, what is the responsibility, if any, of the PA for Palestinians living and voting in Israel? And I wanted to just highlight, not so long ago, there was a very publicized visit of Ayman Odeh, the head of the Joint Arab List, an Israeli political party, meeting with Fatah officials. And I was wondering if you could give us some context for that relationship and in general, if there is any responsibility over the Palestinian citizens of Israel.
Good, very good question. The Palestinian Authority has absolutely zero responsibility for any Palestinian citizens of Israel. Not by mandate, not by PLO mandate, and not by the Oslo Accords mandate. Again, it's only an administrative body for those Palestinians living under military occupation. The Palestinian citizens of Israel have their own political agency represented by political parties in the Israeli system. They are the second largest bloc in the Knesset that nobody talks to because they're Palestinian. So all the different jockeying that happens with the Israeli Jewish parties to be able to create a coalition and to get 61 seats, et cetera, all is happening because they ignore a large bloc of voters who have representation in the Knesset, but they happen not to be Jewish. That's a different story. But as far as the Palestinian Authority is concerned, they have no authority. Having said that, the PLO being the overarching body for all Palestinians everywhere, for me in Youngstown, Ohio, and supposedly for the Palestinian in Haifa, that has become a little bit contentious. Why? Because over time, the Palestinian Liberation Organization also started to focus heavily on those Palestinians under occupation and kind of have not brought other Palestinians into the fold for decision making. So a big question today is, are the Palestinian citizens of Israel part of a PLO? Some will tell you they would like to be, some will tell you not, because now they have their own political agency. And I would point to that website of the Palestine Strategy Group. We put out reports every couple of years. About 2 years ago, we put out a very, very interesting report, and all of these are in English and Arabic, about the relationship between Palestinians under occupation and Palestinians inside Israel. I think you'll find a fascinating discussion because it doesn't only talk about the big picture, but it also talks about, in terms of culture and music and art, of all the different connections between those two communities. And the younger communities are working much closer together, even if they can't politically. And that says a lot about where things might go if we don't actually end this occupation sooner rather than later.
Thank you. And the topic that we have the most questions coming in about is about democracy and how to move society forward in a more democratic fashion. And I was wondering, we saw your points that you sent to Abbas on what you think he should do and the slide of the 3 different approaches. And I was wondering if you could just dig in a little bit more on a grassroots level. There's a lot of young Palestinians today who are very unhappy with their leadership. We don't see elections happening, even though there's talk of it here and there. So what needs to change? What can individuals or groups be doing on the ground to create change? What needs to happen in order to move the society in a more democratic direction?
I used to have a very clear answer. I don't. Remember, I come from Youngstown, Ohio. When I left 25 years ago, my congressman was in jail, the prosecutor was in jail, and the city councilman was in jail. So when we talk about democracy and corruption and how to build a proper society to govern, I'm not sure I come from the best place to have a model to be able to reference. Looking at the US today, I'm not sure the US is that model as well. Having said all of that, there are elements of a democratic society that are taken for granted and we have to focus on. And one of the ones that I speak about very loudly here is the right to assemble and the freedom of speech. Those 2 are key. If we're not, and those are being violated today by the Palestinian Authority, passing decrees, passing laws, which are making it very difficult for Palestinians to organize or even speak out. Today, there's a digital law, which if I put like on a Facebook post that you made, but I only put like on it, I can end up in prison. And that's reflective of how Israel deals with us. We weren't expecting the same kind of practices coming from the Palestinian Authority itself. Just 2 weeks ago, they arrested, I think it was 19 activists that were preparing to hold a demonstration against corruption. Those kinds of rights to freedom and rights to assembly are key. And we're discussing that everywhere in the world today. And we have to discuss it here, and we have to be bold in discussing it, knowing very well that a lot of the pressures that happen on us are externally placed upon us, whether it's the occupation or financial pressures from the US or others. Having all of those and knowing them very well is not an excuse by any stretch of the imagination that within our own tiny community, no matter how tiny it is, that we don't protect the rights that we have available to us within our context. So I might not be able to apply freedom of assembly all across the West Bank because I don't have control all across the West Bank, but I have control in the center of Ramallah. And that should be something I can be able to deal with. And to be very honest, the civil society here has become very polished, and they are very sharp in their campaigns, whether it's teachers coming out on the street, whether it's people who are demonstrating against a very lopsided Social Security law, or whether it's people talking about corruption. We are out there and we are vocal. Sadly, those kinds of campaigns aren't getting covered in the media. People would much rather see in the news that we threw a rock at a soldier at a checkpoint. That makes the nightly news. But to talk about tens of thousands of teachers coming out, talking about teachers' issues, that's not even seen kind of in the media. But nonetheless, those movements are there, they're active, and they're pushing against an administration which is becoming a lot more controlling. And now that the Oslo process has failed and there's no more security cooperation, they're becoming a lot more worried about the potential for them to be knocked off their chairs. And that's making them a little bit more vicious in terms of how they deal with civil society. So one place to help is to link into some of those movements, articulate, amplify what they're doing, support them, and that would be helping us on the domestic scene here.
Thank you so much. We are unfortunately at time for this session. I feel like we could easily spend another hour digging into some of these questions. It has been such a pleasure to have you as a speaker for this session. Really a very comprehensive presentation with lots of breadth and depth to these pressing issues in the Palestinian political system. So I just wanted to say thank you so much, Sam Bahour, for your time.
Thank you.
And to our audience, just a reminder, if you would like to join the discussion session afterwards to engage a bit more with these topics, you can find the link in the chat. And thank you again to Sam, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, and be in touch. All my social media contacts are at epalestine.ps. Have a good conversation. Bye-bye.